The following programme contains themes of sexual abuse.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, "She's in the house, go and find her."
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, a tragic scene found by a dog walker.
He went into the woods to see what his dog was looking at and sadly found this discovery of a young female lying lifeless in the woods.
The news no parent wants to hear.
I did not want to believe them. I was not prepared to believe them.
A killer who thought he could outsmart detectives, but who was given away by his own mobile phone.
If you're not allowing us access to it, you've got something to hide.
It has this wonderful little habit in the background, like all modern smartphones do, of backing up to the cloud, this nebulous collection of data.
This is forensics, catching the killer.
So I can remember quite vividly the morning that I got the call that a body had been found. I was actually at headquarters dealing with another incident and just handing it over and briefing another police force when I received a text message from the duty senior investigating officer saying, "Please ring urgent." So I gave them a call to be told that the body of a young female had been found here in the woods at the sports centre at Southampton.
In 2018, Detective Superintendent Paul Barton was the head of the Hampshire Constabulary's Major Crime Unit.
At 7:45 that morning, a local dog walker was walking through the sports centre and his dog had become distracted in the undergrowth just behind me. So he called his dog a few times, trying to get his attention, and the dog was just not having any of it. So he went into the woods to just explore to see what his dog was looking at, and sadly found this discovery of a young female lying lifeless. It is not a natural death. So I need to start thinking about what resources do I need to try and manage this investigation. Is it a homicide investigation or not? Well, experience would tell me that I think we would treat it as a homicide until we can prove otherwise. It was clear this was going to be a large investigation. It's a public place, it's a young female. Things like this just don't happen normally.
The scene was one of extreme brutality, despite the picturesque surrounding. A young girl lying face down with blood in the leaves around her.
That there was a bottle that was nearby to her. Now, was that her own bottle, or did the offender bring that in with them? Or perhaps it was there anyway, and that might be a potential witness that we could identify by some forensic examinations. She was fully clothed, so for me that would suggest that there was no sexual motivation in this. But I think what was most striking is there was no weapon. And so the fact that we couldn't find a weapon, for me, suggested that, you know, homicide was very likely, and that this young female had been killed and not taken her own life.
Within hours, news of the harrowing discovery in the woods had already started to spread.
We were told by a member of the public who rang into our offices that police had set up a cordon around an area of the Southampton Sports Centre, which is to the north of the city.
James Robinson was a reporter for the Southampton Echo at the time.
There was a fairly heavy police presence at the scene. Of course, whenever anything happens like this, you never necessarily assume the worst, and you never know what's happened. It could be anything from the find of drugs to something more serious like an assault of some type.
But detectives knew already that they were probably looking at a murder site. And that theory was confirmed when they moved the young girl's body, and the source of her wounds became apparent.
It was some sort of knife. It had been mainly used against the neck, which isn't very deep. There were occasional cuts elsewhere. There was a cut on a wrist, a cut on a forearm, something around the back of the shoulder, things like that, which were not very distinctive.
This is probably not just an argument that's got out of hand. This was likely to be a frenzied attack, and probably a planned attack as well. The fact that the female appeared to have been lured into the wooded area, which was secluded from the normal kind of pedestrian traffic that you would expect within the sports centre. And so quite quickly we came to the assessment that this was, you know, this was premeditated, and this was a planned attack against that individual. I think when the call came in, one of the first concerns I had was that, you know, this had happened in a very public place. This was the beginning of the school holidays, the weather was fantastic, and so people were going to be out and about. And at that particular time, we didn't have a named suspect. And so the fear that's running through my mind at that particular time is, you know, who has done this? And more importantly, will they strike again?
In July 2018, a dog walker on the outskirts of Southampton had made a terrible discovery. The body of a young girl lying face down in a woodland. She had suffered multiple stab wounds and a level of brutality that left even hardened police officers shocked.
I think what was really troubling for me was, you know, who could do this to a 13-year-old girl in such a public place. She suffered some horrific injuries, and she wouldn't have died from the first stab wound. You know, she was attacked, you know, in a frenzied attack, I would say, where she had multiple injuries, including defensive wounds. And so, you know, it really troubles me to think what she was going through at that particular time, the fear that she would have faced.
But who was the young girl? Only the night before her body had been found, one local mum, Stacey White, had reported her daughter Lucy as missing.
On the morning that Lucy went missing, I saw her first thing in the morning. I was rushing to get to work, so I briefly said hello and good morning to her, and that I would see her when I got back. By lunchtime, I had a phone call from my partner saying that Lucy hadn't come back for lunch. That didn't concern me. It wasn't unusual. She had keys to my parents' house, so she would often go up there. If she was closer to their house than ours, she would just pop in there for lunch, or she would simply have lunch with a friend. She didn't have to be home until 8 o'clock. She'd said which friend she'd gone to. She was just out. It was the summer holiday. She was having fun. However, when 8 o'clock came and she still wasn't back, concerns started to creep in. She was renowned for being late, so we left it another 30 minutes just in case she was late. She still didn't come back. I then made phone calls, and different family members and friends and parents of Lucy's friends then started looking at the local parks. They started messaging each other to see if Lucy was with them. We put posts up on social media. When we then got to the last park, which was about 9:45 by this point, and she still wasn't home, I rang Hampshire Constabulary and reported her missing.
When DS Paul Barton and his team became aware of this missing persons report, it led to a terrible realization of who the victim in the woods might be.
At that particular time, our records showed that there was only one person that had been reported missing in the last 24 hours, and that was Lucy, who was 13, from the local area.
Lucy's mum, Stacey, was now dealing with every parent's worst nightmare.
The police had come to the house to speak to me. I naively thought that they were going to tell me that they'd found Lucy and that she was okay. They told me that they were 99% sure that it was Lucy at the sports centre. I just went into shock. I did not want to believe them. I was not prepared to believe them until I'd seen with my own eyes that they were telling me the truth. These were people that didn't know my daughter. How could they be correct?
As Lucy's family began to take in the news that she would never be coming back, Home Office pathologist Basil Purdue began his investigation into what had happened to her.
She had 11 stab wounds to the right side of her neck, 3 of which had gone through the biggest artery in the neck, the right common carotid artery, the big one supplying blood from the heart to the head. She had a number of other injuries, which were sharp injuries from cutting to her neck, lower face, and upper limbs.
Eventually, and after the pathologist's work was complete, Stacey was able to see her daughter's body one last time.
I could simply only whisper words to Lucy, words that I won't repeat. But one thing I will say is I promised her that I would get her justice and we would find who did this.
In order to find out who would have done this to a 13-year-old girl and why, detectives first had to understand everything they could about Lucy.
Lucy was a very cheerful, energetic young lady. She set her ambitions very high. She was an overachiever. She was very good academically. She was setting her sights to become a lawyer. She always had a lot of friends. She was full of smiles. She lit up a room as she went into it.
But there were things that detectives began to discover about Lucy, which even her family didn't know.
In any homicide investigation, one of the first lines of inquiry that I will ask to be carried out is what's called a victimology. And that's really going through the background and history of who you believe to be your victim to find out anything that we can that might help us identify who may have done this. And so part of the victimology would be to search the room of the victim and find out what information we can. And it's not unusual within a victimology to find out things that perhaps the family don't even know about. And with Lucy, one of the first things we found was her diary, which was extremely interesting and rang some alarm bells.
It was these diary entries of Lucy's which would give Paul and his team the first clues as to what might have happened to the 13-year-old and why.
So when we looked into Lucy's diary, there were a number of entries in there that had gone back over the last 12 months. And bear in mind, she was 13 years old at the time. 12 months prior to that, she would have been 12. And she was inferring that she'd been in a sexual relationship with an associate of the family who'd been staying at the family home but had recently moved out. and that she believed that she was in a relationship with this individual, and also she planned to have a future with this individual.
These private notes were equally shocking to Lucy's mum, Stacey.
The diary entries were chilling to read. I just felt sick. I physically wanted to throw up. My eyes were streaming. I was struggling to read them, but I needed to read them. And as much as I didn't want to read what was on them, I felt I had to read what was on them because I wanted to see what it was that they had found and what Lucy had said. She said I didn't know. I didn't know what was happening, and if I found out, I would have killed him. She'd said in these diary entries she had not told anybody. I believe that that is the truth, that she had not ever told anybody.
Initially, when I was told about the contents of the diary, and I keep an open mind and think, well, it could all be made up. But then when I started being told about some of the graphic detail that was within that diary, for me, it was quite clear that actually this was reality. And so I was extremely concerned that not only had Lucy been murdered, but she was also the victim of sexual abuse over the last 12 months and maybe even longer. The person that Lucy had described that she was in love with was a male called Stephen Nicholson.
Who was Stephen Nicholson? He was someone, it transpired, who was known to Lucy's family as an acquaintance, and who had taken advantage of their trust and kindness.
When I first met that individual, it was under very different circumstances. He had needed to move out of the premises that he was in. He knew and had been friends with my partner as a child, although they had been out of contact for several years. He had just turned up at our door after being at his sister's birthday party, intoxicated, and he just stumbled through, you know, can I just stay the night at stupid o'clock at night? And he'd been directed to just sleep on the sofa rather than on the streets. This inevitably was a person who had no fixed address. He just sofa surfed. But he picked who he sofa surfed at very well, it would seem.
After that initial night, Nicholson often stayed at the family home, claiming to have nowhere else to go. Through Lucy's diary entries, police began to discover darker motives and a sad story of coercion and abuse.
Within the diary, there were things like Lucy had been practicing, you know, her new signature as if she was going to get married to this individual. So it was extremely concerning. Quite clearly, he was grooming her. Once we knew of Stephen Nicholson's involvement with Lucy, he became a person of interest very, very quickly to the investigation. At that point, we were unsure as to why he would want to kill her, but we certainly had evidence that would suggest that he was in a sexual relationship with her, and the fact that this had been going on from the age of 12, it was statutory rape, and therefore he became a suspect, certainly for rape.
With a key suspect in their sights, the priority now for Paul and his team was to track down Nicholson. In 2018, police in Southampton investigating the killing of a 13-year-old girl had unearthed a terrible secret detailed in the child's diary. It revealed that Lucy had been abused for a year prior to her death by a man known to her family, Stephen Nicholson. Now detectives were on the hunt for a suspected paedophile and possibly a murderer. And the pressure to find that killer was mounting.
As a senior investigating officer for any murder investigation, I describe it as a privilege to be able to investigate somebody's murder and bring someone to justice for that person who sadly can't give evidence themselves and speak for themselves. But with that comes an awful lot of pressure on you as well to get it right and get that person. You know, these types of crimes attract a lot of media attention.
But within hours, police had located their suspect, Stephen Nicholson, and he wasn't far away.
So officers were dispatched, and within 24 hours he was located at nearby Millbrook railway station by police officers and arrested without any further incident.
With Nicholson now in custody, Paul Barton's team began the task of interviewing him.
So when a person is brought into custody, they are offered free legal advice. It's not unsurprising that the advice they are given by their solicitor at that particular time is to go no comment. But much to my surprise, when Nicholson was interviewed, he started talking and began to give an account as to his movements that day.
Detective Chief Inspector David Story oversaw the first interview with Nicholson in custody.
He told us that on the morning that Lucy left the address, he had taken a day off sick and was working, doing some private work for an elderly gentleman whom he had been caring for a number of years. And it so happened that that individual lived very close to the scene where Lucy was found.
Nicholson said that he arrived at this old man's address at about 9 o'clock. He was sent off to the nearby Tesco Express to go and get him some cigarettes and some biscuits. And we actually clearly find him on CCTV at Tesco Express at 9:02 that morning. He's got a bag for life in his hand. He goes back to the old man's address and he effectively stays there till about 11 o'clock. And then he cycles home and he gives us the route that he takes on his bike.
Detectives now had an account of Nicholson's movements, but could CCTV reveal vital clues about Lucy's whereabouts on the day she died?
Lucy left her house at 9 o'clock on the Wednesday morning, and she'd asked for a watch from one of her brothers because she didn't have a mobile phone. She'd broken her mobile phone. We tried to track what Lucy had been doing that morning prior to her being found in Southampton Sports Centre. So we looked at various routes she could have taken and scoped for CCTV, and that subsequently showed Lucy marching from her home address up to the sports centre, and she was probably captured on CCTV about 10 occasions. The last sighting of her was just outside Tesco's near the sports centre. Lucy had left with her coat on, and she was carrying a small sports isotonic bottle. What was quite significant about that was that you could just see on the CCTV that the bottle was mostly full throughout the journey. Despite it being hot, it remained full. And also she took her jacket off, which just was an indication of how hot it was. When Lucy was found, there was a bottle, the same as identified within the CCTV, which had the majority of the liquid still present, so she wouldn't have had much of an opportunity to have drunk that during the course of the day, which would suggest that she'd been murdered quite quickly after her last sighting.
Police turned to digital forensics to see if Nicholson's alibi rang true.
So Nicholson has a mobile phone, so we could check his mobile phone to see if that had moved. But actually Nicholson had offered that up himself in an interview, saying, you can check my phone, it shows that I was there, because he obviously knows that we can do tracking through cell site if his phone had been moving around. And sure enough, when we checked on the cell site, his phone showed that it had been static at this address for the time that he was saying. But I think what he forgets is that actually all that is telling me is that his phone is there, but he is not necessarily with that phone.
While his phone's location might have been static, a deep dive by digital forensic experts gave them an insight into Nicholson's behaviour.
So looking at Nicholson's call records, what was visible was a pattern of activity, particularly around text messages, where it was obvious that he was the sort of person who would reply to a text message very quickly after it arrived. But there was a period of time where that simply didn't happen over several hours. It was obvious that the phone wasn't moving because text messages were coming into it and they were all being received through the same mast. So it was probably just sitting in a single location, but no replies were being sent. And that didn't fit with the normal pattern of activity that Nicholson had exhibited up to that point. That allowed questions to be asked. Why hadn't he been replying the way he normally would?
Detectives realised that Nicholson's phone might hold the answers they needed.
When Nicholson was arrested, he did have a mobile phone with him, but we quickly established it wasn't the mobile phone he would have had in possession on the Wednesday. And he did tell us that he had disposed of his mobile phone because there was drug dealing activity on it and he didn't want to be prosecuted for that. Clearly, we didn't believe him. We thought he'd disposed of the phone because it had something incriminating on it.
And so we said, well, okay, we haven't got your handset, but we can still log into your data. If you just give us your password for your Facebook account, then we can have a look and see if there's any conversations between you and Lucy. And so he was asked for his password, and that was the first time that he then sort of showed some resistance in the interview and declined to give us his password.
As a detective, if someone's refusing you access to something, I naturally will think that's suspicious. I mean, clearly there are rights which I have to respect, but in relation to this, if you've been arrested for the murder of a 13-year-old girl and we're suggesting that there is Facebook contact between you and her on the morning that she disappears and is subsequently found murdered, I think that if you're not allowing us access to it, you've got something to hide.
When something like a missing persons inquiry or a murder inquiry, we would want to look at both the victim and the suspect's profiles, if possible, to find out, obviously, has there been contact between them? If there was contact, when was that contact? What type of contact was it? Is there an indication that they were planning to meet up for some reason? Do we know where they were going to meet? And if we find indications like that, we'll go beyond it. We'll start looking at other activity on the devices. So, for example, has one of them been researching particular routes to a meeting point or particular meeting points?
And when we established that Lucy had access to other media devices within the family home, we obviously seized those items and started to examine them. And what we established was that the conversation that we believe had taken place between Nicholson and Lucy had been deleted.
So we didn't have the mobile phone, but what was most important about Nicholson was his contact with Lucy the night before and on the morning of her murder.
With no evidence to charge Nicholson with Lucy's murder, police were rapidly running out of time before having to either charge or release him. To buy detectives more time, they now turned to legislation normally used to detain terrorists.
Under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act of 2000, or RIPA as it's known in the police, there's a piece in there that talks about when police are investigating a crime and they want to get access to somebody's password, then they can, under this legislation, effectively demand the password from the suspect. And if they don't give that password, then they technically commit a criminal offence. And it's normally used for things like counter-terrorism, but it's also used for paedophiles and indecent images of children. It was the first time that I've used this legislation in a murder investigation. I think probably the first time in Hampshire and possibly nationally it had been used in a murder investigation. Nicholson was then presented with the request to give his password, and he again refused. And so he was charged with that offence, and he was remanded in custody, went up to court the following morning, where effectively it's an absolute defence. You don't really have a defence to say why you hadn't given your password under those circumstances. And so he had no option but to plead guilty there and then in front of the magistrate. And he was given a 14-month prison sentence there and then.
The RIPA charge is a brilliant tactical holding charge to keep someone in custody so that they cannot interfere with any investigation that you're going to subsequently undertake. So he couldn't interfere with any witnesses, he couldn't dispose of any evidence. We had him in a secure environment and we could undergo our investigation.
With the benefit of this extra time, Paul's team began investigating Nicholson's movements through his mobile phone.
One of the problems in Nicholson's case was that there was nothing actually available from the phone directly. But being a relatively modern smartphone, it has this wonderful little habit in the background, like all modern smartphones do, of backing up to the cloud, this nebulous collection of data that exists on computers spread around the world.
So we didn't have the phone, but one of my team came up with the very bright and very innovative idea of cloning his phone. Because we had gained access to his Google account, we got a phone, we cloned it, same make, etc. And then when we turned it on, it downloaded all the data from his Google account. That data was gold dust to us because it then provided locations as to where Stephen Nicholson was.
Data relating particularly to a Fitbit was recovered. And Fitbit being an activity tracking device, there was all sorts of interesting information there about timings and movements.
He had told us that he had taken the same route he usually took when he had left the address at 11 o'clock on the Wednesday morning. So, being diligent police officers, we checked what he was saying, married up with what we now had from his phone. And we could see that on the journey back at about 1100 hours on the Wednesday morning, he took a slight detour. The majority of it was on the way back, but he took a 7-minute detour, which took him into an area called Tanner's Brook, a small secondary wooded area in between two estates. And that clearly was of interest to us as investigators.
Smart technology had highlighted discrepancies in Nicholson's journey. But detectives still needed hard evidence to prove his involvement in Lucy's murder.
Tanner's Brook is an area of natural beauty within the heart of Millbrook, surrounded by lush plants, a stream running all the way through. And for me, this area was really significant because what we also saw on our CCTV as we picked it up was that Nicholson was seen on his bike coming down in this area with his Tesco bag, which seemed quite full up at the time. And then when he re-emerges later on, we find that his bag is less full up, and therefore the inference being is that he's deposited something here in Tanner's Brook.
Could the vital forensic clues to link Nicholson to Lucy's murder lie here, hidden amongst the undergrowth? Southampton, 2018. And police are trying to solve the brutal murder of a 13-year-old girl. They've got a suspect in custody, but now they desperately need to find the forensic evidence that can link Stephen Nicholson to the crime. CCTV and digital forensics had placed him near an area of Tanner's Brook on the day of the murder. Now, Detective Superintendent Paul Barton authorised specialist police search teams who started combing the area for clues.
I pushed the button and said, right, let's go and search this area and let's see what we can find. And actually on day one, we struck lucky. The search team, within a few hours, found a Tesco bag for life that had some fire damage to it. And inside that was the jackpot as far as I was concerned. We found a number of items. The first one was some fire-damaged boxer shorts. What was left was literally the waistband of these boxer shorts and the label that was inside. And the label indicated that these were a pack of 3 Tesco boxer shorts. And that is interesting because when we searched Nicholson's home address, we found the other 2 pairs that would match that 3rd pair. But not only that, inside the bag, we found some blue rubber gloves that had apparent blood on them. In addition to those items, we found a blue sweatshirt, hooded sweatshirt, which had again apparent blood on there and some fire damage. We didn't know whether that was Nicholson's or not, but obviously we were seizing that to send that off to the lab for some forensic examination. And we found some tracksuit bottoms, which were sort of black and white with an unusual pattern on the side. And again, whilst we couldn't say that was Nicholson's, by doing some research on Nicholson and looking at his social media account, we found an old photograph of him. He was wearing identical tracksuit bottoms to the ones that we'd found.
But could forensics prove, beyond doubt, that these items did indeed belong to Nicholson and, crucially, also link them to Lucy?
The priority was to send those off for forensic examination, so that's what we did. And within 24 hours, we were getting some very exciting phone calls from the scientists to say what they had found.
What the forensic scientists had found, finally, was DNA proof.
There was a blood stain that went through DNA profiling and yielded a DNA profile that matched Lucy. And there was also an additional 6 areas of blood staining that yielded mixed DNA profiles from more than one person, parts of which matched Lucy and parts matched Nicholson. And there was one area that was found to match Lucy's profile, that the statistics involved were 210 million times more likely that it was Lucy's profile than that of an unrelated female, and one part of a mixed profile that matched Nicholson that was 93 times more likely to match Nicholson than an unrelated male. There was a pair of blue surgical gloves found at Tanner's Brook, which yielded a full DNA profile matching Nicholson.
And then the jacket of Lucy's that Lucy was wearing at the time when she was found had also been examined, and that had blue fibres that then also came back to the Russell Athletic top that we found at Tanner's Brook.
Forensic analysis of blood, DNA and fibres now all link Nicholson to Lucy. It was a major breakthrough for investigators.
Now, I got those results when I was walking my dog, and when I got the phone call, my hands just went in the air as if I'd scored a goal at Wembley. I was so elated at what I was being told, because it had been so difficult beforehand that we didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden we'd cracked it. I knew at that point that Stephen Nicholson would be convicted of Lucy's murder.
Once we had all the forensic evidence back on Nicholson, we spoke to the Crown Prosecution Service and said, look, we think we've got sufficient evidence. And so he was produced from Winchester Prison, brought back into custody at Southampton Central, and then we had the interview teams go in there and interview him again. And so as part of our disclosure during the interview, we then hit him with the evidence that we had, which was, we've searched Tanner's Brook, we found these items have got your DNA on it, and these items have got Lucy's DNA on it. What have you got to say about it? And his face was just a picture, his jaw just dropped. And at that point, funny enough, he went no comment.
Finally, Paul and the homicide team had enough evidence for Stephen Nicholson to be tried for Lucy's murder. That trial started in June 2019.
On the first day of the trial, Nicholson seemed almost excited. He seemed to enjoy the fact that there was some kind of attention on him. Of course, we weren't here for him. We were here for Lucy. But Nicholson seemed to revel in the attention at first. But as the trial went on, his demeanour changed completely. But he remained arrogant and narcissistic right through the trial. He would swagger into the courtroom each day. It was like he didn't want to be there. He just couldn't care less.
What he was saying was that she was just a silly girl who had a schoolgirl crush on him, and he found her quite annoying. And yes, he was quite nasty towards her towards the end, because he just didn't like the attention he was getting from her and found that she was effectively a pain.
Lucy's mum, Stacey, went to the trial every day.
His attitude was still exactly the same. He still looked as though he felt he was going to get away with it. And whilst I only briefly looked at him, because I had no care to be looking at that person for any prolonged period of time, he even had the audacity to stand in court whilst giving evidence and thank me and my partner, for all the help that we'd given him. Which was just salt to the wound. He wasn't thankful, because if he had been thankful, he would have stayed away from my daughter. If he had been genuinely thankful, he would not have done what he did. He would not have been looking at a child in that way. He would not have continued over the span of years that he did to have done what he done.
After all the evidence was heard, the jury retired and they came back relatively shortly with a guilty verdict for murder. He was given a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 33 years.
Finally, justice for Lucy. But with Nicholson's conviction for murder came even more revelations about his past.
When we're investigating Nicholson, we go very much into his past and interviewed a lot of people whom he'd interacted with. What we did find, and he was subsequently charged with it as well, as we'd found out that he had met a 14-year-old girl a number of years earlier when he was 18, and he had actually had sex with her in almost the same location as Lucy had been murdered. That was particularly chilling from my point of view, that this area, this location meant something to him. He'd actually had sex with a 14-year-old girl a number of years earlier, but then he'd also chosen to lure Lucy to the same location and murder her in that brutal fashion.
For me, what was particularly sad about this investigation is that, Lucy was a 13-year-old girl, a typical teenager, and she had fallen in love with Nicholson, who I would say had groomed her from the very beginning for his own sexual gratification. But as far as she was concerned, she was in a relationship with him and potentially was going to marry him one day. She was practicing her new signature with him, which I know children do, but this kind of shows that the affection that she had for him. But when he realised that actually, I could be in trouble for this and I'm going to get found out, and so I need to end the relationship with her. And that's when he started being nasty towards her and effectively dismissing her and breaking off the relationship with her. And she was obviously heartbroken by that, and she wanted to continue contacting him. And I think, potentially sort of threatened him and said, if you don't continue to see me, then I will tell my mum that, we've been having a sexual relationship. At some stage, he obviously decided to respond to her messaging and said, yeah, okay, I'll meet you on that morning at 9:30 at the sports centre. And so I can only imagine that she was going to that sports centre and she actually genuinely thought that she was going to see Nicholson to patch things up and get things back on track again. But little did she know that she was effectively walking to her death.
Lucy was very streetwise, but it didn't help this situation. If people point fingers and say that they would know that something like this was happening to their own child, they're naive. Children are very canny at being secretive. Perpetrators are very savvy at telling your child what they want to hear, making them keep it a secret. And most of the time they will get to know the child enough to get enough information out of them to be able to then use something as a bargaining tool. If you tell anyone, I'm not going to do this anymore, or I'm not going to give you money, or I will hurt your family, and to some of the worst ones, I will kill you. He took Lucy. And none of us are going to get over that. You have to learn to live alongside her not being here while still wanting her here. You have to be, or at least appear happy and enthusiastic whilst her friends and other children of similar ages are graduating and they're having babies and they're in long-term relationships. And as lovely as that is, it is hard. It is really hard. Because that's what she should be doing, and she's not. And one person's decisions took all that away.